Thank you so much, Sorrija, for giving us a very nice narrative of the comparison and also discrepancies of both countries, what they are implied for both producers. I really like more or less the part when you said the things that actually affects both of them, both countries, which is infrastructure and price volatility, which I'm pretty sure that Joe will come back to that after this. So Joe, actually, however, I do work with Joe. I wouldn't be fair to give his introduction without this piece of paper. So Joe Glauber is a senior research fellow here at IFPRI, based in Washington, D.C., where his areas of interest are price volatility, global grain reserves, crop insurance, and trade. Prior to joining IFPRI, Joe spent over 30 years at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including as chief economist from 2008 to 2014. As chief economist, he was responsible for the department's agricultural forecast and projections, oversaw climate, energy, and regulatory issues, and served as a chairman of the board of directors of the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. From 2007 to 2009, Glauber was the special Doha agricultural envoy at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where he served as chief agricultural negotiator in the Doha talks. He served as economic advisor at the so-called Blair House agreements leading to the completion of the Uruguay round negotiations. He is the author of numerous studies on crop insurance, disaster policy, and U.S. farm policy. He received his PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Wisconsin in 1984 and holds an AB in anthropology from the University of Chicago. In 2012, he was elected fellow of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. And you think the least I could have done is given a shortened version of the bio for you. It's very nice to be here. And I think, again, like the other speakers have said, just an excellent panel. And, you look at U.S. and EU policies, they have evolved a lot over the last 30 years. You think of the sort of highly regulated markets that we had back in the 80s when most of the support was done through high price supports. A lot of that surplus ended up on world markets in the form of export subsidies. And I think a lot of progress has been made since then, moving things to more decoupled forms of payment, and certainly with greater emphasis on more public goods like environmental services and other things. Yet, if you look, there's still a lot of money going into the sector from both the EU and the U.S. In terms of those levels measured by the OECD and others. We still have a lot of both countries, or both the EU and the U.S. Still support agriculture very, very highly. Although, again, I think if you look in terms of overall movements, you have seen a constant reduction and a move towards less distortive forms of production. Let me talk a little bit about where I think there are some differences, and one is crop insurance. I think if you look at in the U.S., crop insurance generally is now the largest single safety net program. It accounts for about 40% of what I would consider farm program support. And that's really a big change over the last 30 years as well, when it was a very, very minor program back in the 80s. Now it, again, is the largest single program. And not just only that, it's not just providing yield insurance, but where available, most farmers now opt for revenue insurance. The other thing is that a recent legislation in the U.S., the Bipartisan Budget Act, removed the cap on livestock products, so we may see more there as well. In the U.S., by contrast, I think we've essentially had national programs that there has been support given in so-called Pillar 2, but for the Director General, I think when we get into some of the back and forth with question and answers, one of the things that would be interesting is to hear your views on how you see insurance evolving. And I guess in particular on things like livestock insurance and revenue insurance. I think Director General Playwood talked a lot about the budget pressures the EU is under, and I think that particularly because of Brexit and this farm bill, I think, you're struck by the fact that essentially is the baseline that the old Farm Bill would have had if that had been continued. So a question I think I'd raise for you, Undersecretary, is we know with the recent tax reform and other things that now budget projections in the U.S. are showing some pretty large deficits or potential deficits over the next 10 years. Unclear how that will all work out. But I guess it would be great to hear from you about longer term how you view the budget having any sort of impact. And I know you and I worked a lot on farm programs in the 80s and 90s when budgets were an issue. And even the last one, the 2008 Farm Bill or 2014 Farm Bill, had a budget component, had some budget cuts in there. But again, this one did not. So it would be interesting to hear your views on that. And then, thirdly, the other interesting thing to me is we talk a lot about the move to more decoupled forms of support, and I think that has been a really important thing. Particularly when you compare it to price supports and other things that we see developing countries like India and China embracing, do have potentials because of their link directly to production of potentially distorting things. But that said, if you look at the mid-90s when the U.S. switched over to a decoupled payments, the EU then moved in the early 2000s with the single farm payments to decoupling. Since that time, we have seen a little bit of changes. The EU in the U.S., for example, in 2014, the Congress decided to eliminate the old direct payments, the decoupled payments, and go back to price-based payments. Again, still based on historical production, but now tied to price. And I think Jesus mentioned this as well in his comments as being a difference between that and the EU. But even in the EU, what we have seen is a lot of, with more recent legislation, we have seen where the single farm payment, it's been less vulnerable to criticism. And in the U.S., the criticism really has been, hey, why are these guys getting payments when prices are so high and you're giving them payment? I think the EU has been more successful in putting that criticism away by spending a lot of time tying those to environmental programs and other things, which, by the way, I think the U.S. has a lot of those same cross-compliance features in the old direct payment program. But all the same, in a lot of member states now, they are allowed some option of linking some portion of that single farm payment to production. And so I think that I would like, if possible, if we have time, if both of you could kind of address that as well. But otherwise, I'm way over my time. And so I'm going to leave and sit down with the rest of you and answer questions. Thanks.